You wouldn't believe the stuff people call us for out here in Texas. Some of it's silly. Lost dogs, missing lawn chairs, UFO sightings after one too many beers. But every now and then, we get a call that sticks with you, like the one I answered back in '06, out near an old ranch called Devil's Hollow. It was a little past midnight when the dispatcher patched the call through. A woman's voice, frantic, shaking like a rattler's tail. "There's something in my barn," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. It's not right." I could hear her breathing, shallow and quick, like she was afraid even the sound of her voice might set something off. I tried to keep my tone calm. "Ma'am, can you describe what you're seeing?" She didn't answer right away, just this dead silence on the line. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a sucker punch. "It's got too many eyes." I figured she was either drunk or off her meds, but protocol's protocol. I hopped in my cruiser and headed out. The night was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows your headlights whole. As I got closer to her place, I started noticing the animals, cattle, goats, even the dogs, all huddled together as far from the barn as they could get. When I pulled up, the woman, Sarah, was waiting on her porch, clutching a shotgun like her life depended on it. She didn't look drunk. She looked terrified. "It's still in there," she said, pointing toward the barn. The barn was an old, rickety thing, leaning like it had too much whiskey. I could hear noises inside, scraping, rustling, this low, guttural sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I shone my flashlight around, stepping carefully through the barn doors. The smell hit me first, wet, metallic, like blood and dirt mixed together. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A man hunched over, his back to me. But then he turned, and I swear to God I almost dropped my flashlight. She wasn't kidding about the eyes. They weren't human, big, glossy things, black as oil spills, scattered across his face like someone had painted them on at random. His mouth stretched into this grin that was too wide, showing teeth that looked more like broken glass than anything that belonged in a human skull. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like they were bolted to the ground. The thing took a step toward me, moving like it didn't quite understand how legs were supposed to work. "Sheriff," it rasped, and my stomach turned. Its voice was wet, like it was gargling on its own blood. I raised my gun. "Don't move," I shouted, but my voice cracked halfway through. It laughed, low at first, then louder, echoing through the barn, and then, just as quick as it started, it stopped. "You don't belong here," it said, those words sticking in my brain like barbed wire. The next thing I knew, the lights in the barn flickered, dimming like something was draining the life out of the place. When they came back on, the thing was gone. Just gone. I searched that barn top to bottom, but there wasn't a single trace of it. No footprints, no blood, no nothing. Sarah swore she hadn't seen it leave, and the animals outside were still acting like the devil himself was hiding out there. To this day, I don't know what I saw. But every now and then, when I'm out on patrol late at night, I swear I catch a glimpse of those eyes in the darkness, watching, waiting. So yeah, we get some weird calls. But that one's the reason I keep a loaded shotgun next to my bed every single night. You stay in this job long enough, you see some things. Ghost stories come to life, folks acting like they're straight out of a horror movie. But there's one call I got back in 2013 that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. It started like any other Friday night. Quiet, save for the occasional drunk driver. Around 2 a.m., dispatch patched me through to a call from a woman named Lila Mayfield. She lived way out on a dirt road near Lake Travis, and her voice was calm but shaky, like she was trying real hard not to panic. "Sheriff," she said, "there's a kid on my porch. Now we get plenty of stray kids out here, runaways or kids sneaking out." I figured this was no different. "What's the kid doing?" I asked. "Just standing there, not saying a word." When I pulled up to her place about 20 minutes later, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No wind, no crickets, just dead silence. Her house sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by thick oak trees. She was peeking through the curtains when I knocked, and she didn't open the door until she'd triple-checked it was me. "He's still out there," she whispered, pointing toward the front porch. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight around, and sure enough, there he was. A boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, standing dead still at the edge of the porch. He was barefoot, wearing what looked like old-fashioned pajamas, the kind with buttons up the front. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. "Hey, buddy," I called out, keeping my voice steady. "You lost? Where are your parents?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me, just stood there staring straight ahead. I stepped closer, shining the light in his face. That's when I noticed his eyes. They weren't right. Too dark, like the pupils had swallowed up the whites entirely, and his skin, pale as a sheet, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Kid," I said again, louder this time. "You okay?" He finally moved, just a little, tilting his head the other way. And then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was slow, deliberate, spreading across his face like he was testing it out for the first time. His teeth were small and sharp, too sharp, like the kind you see on fish or some kind of predator. That's when Lila screamed from inside the house. I spun around, running back to the door. She was standing in the middle of the living room, pointing toward the hallway. "There's another one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I followed her gaze and saw it. A second kid, identical to the one on the porch, standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. Same dark eyes, same eerie stillness. But this one was barefoot, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor, like he'd walked straight out of a lake. "Get out!" I shouted, drawing my gun. The kid in the hallway didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, that same slow, deliberate motion, like he was studying me. "Sheriff," Lila whispered, clutching my arm. "They're not kids." I didn't wait to find out what she meant. I grabbed her, pulled her outside, and locked the door behind us. But when I turned back to the porch, the first kid was gone. I radioed for backup, but by the time anyone else got there, both of them had vanished. No footprints, no signs they'd ever been there. Lila moved out of that house the next day, said she couldn't stay another night. And I don't blame her. The weirdest part? 2 weeks later, a fisherman found an old rowboat washed up on the shore of Lake Travis. Inside were 2 sets of children's pajamas, soaking wet, and a photograph. The photo was faded, but you could still make out 2 kids standing side by side, smiling. Their eyes were pitch black. Some calls stick with you. That one, I still check my back seat before I get in my car, every single time. People think being a sheriff in Texas is all about car chases and bar fights, but most of the time it's quiet. Real quiet, except for calls like the one I got in the fall of '98. That one, it still haunts me. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of night where the only sounds are the wind in the mesquites and the occasional coyote howl. I was just finishing a round of coffee when the call came in. An older man named Jack Dorsey lived on the edge of the Palo Duro Canyon, said there was something wrong with his neighbor's house. "Lights are on, Sheriff," he said, his voice cracking like static. "But they ain't supposed to be. Nobody's lived there in years. Now, out here, folks don't call for no reason." If Jack said something was wrong, I believed him. The drive out to the canyon was uneventful. The moon was out, big and full, casting a pale light over the rocky terrain. Jack was waiting by the road when I got there, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. "It's been like that for hours," he said, pointing to the old Williams place. Sure enough, the windows were glowing, but not with regular light. It was this strange, bluish hue, like someone had set up floodlights inside. The house itself was falling apart, shutters hanging loose, weeds choking the driveway, shingles missing from the roof. "No one's been in there since the Williams family disappeared," Jack muttered. That stopped me cold. I'd heard the story. Who hadn't? The whole family just vanished one night back in the '70s. No signs of struggle, no goodbye notes, nothing. Their house had sat empty ever since, slowly crumbling under the weight of time and whispers. I told Jack to wait by his truck and headed toward the house. flashlight in one hand, the other resting on my holster. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, like walking into a storm, but without the wind. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the warped wooden floor. The light was brighter inside, almost blinding, but there wasn't a single lamp or bulb to be found. It was just there, pulsing faintly like it was alive. The furniture was still there, dusty and covered in cobwebs, but untouched. A family photo sat on the mantel, the smiling faces of Mr. and Mrs. Williams and their two kids staring back at me. That's when I heard it, a low hum, barely audible at first, rising and falling in a strange rhythm. It wasn't mechanical, though. It sounded organic, like a chorus of voices just out of sync with each other. "Sheriff?" I spun around, heart hammering. The voice was soft, almost playful, but it didn't come from any one direction. It came from everywhere. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. Just that hum, growing louder, more insistent. I followed the sound up the staircase, every step creaking under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, cracked open, spilling that unnatural blue light into the darkness. I pushed it open and froze. The Williams family was there, sitting around a dining table like nothing had changed in 30 years. Only, it wasn't right. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glowed the same eerie blue as the light. "Sheriff," Mr. Williams said, his voice calm, like he'd been expecting me. "You're late." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The hum was deafening now, vibrating in my chest. "You should have come sooner," Mrs. Williams added, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "They're almost here." "Who?" I finally managed to croak. "Who's coming?" The kids turned to look at me, their glowing eyes locking onto mine. They grinned in unison, wide and unnatural. "The ones who took us," they said together, their voices blending into a single otherworldly tone. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to my cruiser, but when I did, Jack was gone. His truck was there, headlights still on, but he was nowhere to be found. I called for backup, but by the time anyone else got there, the lights were gone, and the house was dark again. They searched every inch of that place, but there was no sign of the Williams family or Jack. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that house. I don't know what "they" meant or where Jack went. But every now and then, late at night, I'll hear that hum again, faint and distant, like it's calling me back. You wouldn't think being a sheriff in a small Texas town could be all that strange. Sure, we deal with our fair share of drunks, domestic disputes, and the occasional cattle theft. But most nights, it's quiet. That was until the Skinner call came in. I still can't believe I lived through it. It was late October 2014. The weather was cool, rare for that time of year, and the sky was clear. I was 2 cups deep into a pot of bad coffee when dispatch buzzed in. "Sheriff, you better head out to the old Skinner place. Got a call from a man claims he saw something. Couldn't quite say what. Sounded pretty shaken up." The Skinner farm had been abandoned for years, sitting on a forgotten patch of land just shy of the Pecos River. Locals whispered about it being cursed. Bad blood, they said. Something about old man Skinner losing his mind back in the 60s and taking an axe to his family. The details were always murky, but people liked their ghost stories. I pulled up around 11 p.m. The place looked exactly how you'd expect. Barn leaning to one side, windows busted out, fields overrun with weeds. My headlights caught a man standing by the main gate, pacing. He was tall, wiry, maybe late 50s, and looked like he'd seen a ghost. "You the one who called?" I asked, stepping out of my cruiser. He nodded, eyes darting toward the house. "Something's in there. Ain't no animal neither." I sighed, figuring it was probably raccoons or maybe a meth head squatting. "What did you see?" He shook his head. It wasn't right. Too big. And it talked. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I played it off. "All right, stay here. I'll check it out." The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, it smelled like mold and rotten wood. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I called out, "Sheriff's Department, anybody here?" Nothing, just silence. I started toward the kitchen when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails on wood. My heart kicked up a notch. "Come on out," I said, trying to sound authoritative. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The scraping stopped. Then, from upstairs, a low guttural laugh. I froze. It wasn't just the laugh itself, it was the way it echoed, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking more than I liked. No answer. Just a thud, heavy and deliberate, from the second floor. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my boots. At the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, doors lining each side. One of them was ajar, light spilling out from within. I pushed it open with the barrel of my flashlight. The room was empty, save for a single chair sitting in the middle. On the chair was a piece of old leather, stretched taut and nailed down at the corners. Only, it wasn't leather. It was skin. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. That's when I heard it again, that laugh, louder this time, coming from behind me. I spun around, gun drawn, but the hallway was empty. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, tall and twisted, its limbs too long, standing at the end of the hall. Then the light steadied, and it was gone. "So, Sheriff?" a voice called out from the stairs. I turned to see the man who'd called me, standing halfway up the steps, looking pale as a sheet. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I snapped. I heard something. Thought you might need backup." Before I could respond, the door to the room slammed shut behind me. We both jumped, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The man stepped closer, his face twisted in fear. "You feel that?" he whispered. I did. The air had changed, thicker, colder, like the room was holding its breath. And then we heard it. "Help me." The voice was faint, trembling, but unmistakable. It sounded like a child, coming from somewhere deep in the house. The man backed away, shaking his head. "I'm not sticking around for this." Before I could stop him, he bolted, running back down the stairs and out the front door. I was alone. The voice called out again, this time clearer. "Please, help me." It was coming from the basement. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't just walk away, not if there was a chance someone was really down there. The basement door was heavy, the hinges groaning as I opened it. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow staircase that disappeared into the black. I descended slowly, the steps creaking under my weight. The smell hit me halfway down, damp, metallic, like blood and decay. At the bottom, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the wall. Writing, scrawled in what looked like blood. "It takes what you love." The room was empty, save for a large wooden crate in the center. The voice came again, louder now, more desperate. "Help me, please." I approached the crate, heart pounding, and pried it open. Inside was a girl, no older than 10, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at me, her lips trembling. "Please," she whispered. "It's still here." Before I could respond, the air shifted again, and I felt it. Something watching us. I turned, and there it was. Tall, impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a nightmare. Hollow eyes, a mouth full of jagged teeth, and hands ending in long black claws. It smiled. I didn't think. I grabbed the girl and bolted up the stairs, the creature's laughter chasing us. I didn't stop until we were outside, collapsing onto the dirt. When I turned back to the house, it was dark again, silent as the grave. The girl wouldn't say a word after that. She just stared at the house, trembling. We never found out who she was or where she came from. She disappeared from the hospital 2 days later, leaving behind nothing but a bloody handprint on the window. As for me, I don't go near the Skinner place anymore. Some calls are best left unanswered. You stay in this job long enough, you learn not to ask too many questions. Not because you don't want answers, but because you're afraid of what they might be. Take the call I got back in July of '03. It wasn't my first weird case, but it's the one that stayed with me the longest. The call came in just past midnight. Dispatch said a woman named Clara Weaver had called in, claiming her husband, Roy, had gone missing in the middle of their field. Now I'd known the Weavers for years. Good folks. Salt of the earth. They owned a stretch of farmland out near Lake Meredith, miles from anything resembling civilization. If Clara was calling at that hour, something bad had happened. The drive out was quiet, just the hum of my cruiser and the faint whine of cicadas in the summer air. When I pulled up to the Weaver place, Clara was waiting on the porch, a flashlight in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling. "It took him." I frowned. "Took him? What do you mean?" She pointed toward the cornfield, her hand shaking. "We were out there checking on the irrigation system when we heard something, like a hum real low. And then Roy, he just disappeared." I looked at her for a long moment. People don't just disappear. Not in Texas, not anywhere. "You sure he didn't just get turned around in the rows? Maybe he's still out there waiting for you to call for help." Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and wild. "No, I saw it, Sheriff. I saw the light. It came down, swallowed him up, and then it was gone." Now, I'm no believer in UFOs or little green men, but something about the way she said it made the hair on my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and told her to stay put. The field was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the whole world's holding its breath. My boots crunched on the dry dirt as I walked down one of the rows, the corn towering over me on either side. "Roy!" I called out. My voice sounded small against the stillness. That's when I noticed it. A patch of corn flattened in a perfect circle, the stalks lying in neat spirals. The dirt in the center was scorched, black and brittle like it had been hit with a blowtorch. I crouched down, running my fingers over the charred ground. It was warm, like whatever had done this hadn't been gone long. Then I heard it. A rustling, soft at first, coming from deeper in the field. "Roy?" I called again, standing and shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The rustling stopped, and then, from somewhere far off, I heard a voice. "Sheriff." It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I'd recognize that voice anywhere. It was Roy. "Roy, where are you?" I shouted, pushing through the corn. The stalks seemed thicker now, the rows twisting in ways that didn't make sense. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. When the beam steadied, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the next row. It was Roy. He was facing away from me, his body stiff, arms hanging limply at his sides. "Roy," I said, my voice low, cautious. "What's going on? Clara's worried sick." He didn't respond, didn't move. I took a step closer, then another. When I was just a few feet away, he turned. His face wasn't right. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his pupils so dilated they looked like black holes. His mouth hung open, lips twitching like he was trying to speak, but couldn't quite remember how. And his skin, God, his skin. It was pale, almost translucent, with veins dark and pulsing just beneath the surface. "Roy," I said again, softer this time. "What happened to you?" He tilted his head, bird-like, and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of recognition or relief. It was hungry. Before I could react, the humming started again, low and steady, vibrating in my chest. Roy's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. "They're coming," he whispered. "Who's coming?" I demanded, backing away. But he didn't answer. Instead, he reached up, his fingers clawing at his own face, tearing at the flesh like it didn't belong to him. Blood poured down his cheeks, but he didn't flinch, didn't scream. The humming grew louder, and the light returned. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen, bright and cold, shifting in colors that didn't seem natural. It filled the sky, casting long, unnatural shadows across the field, and then Roy was gone. 1 second, he was standing there, and the next, the light swallowed him whole. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the light grew brighter, hotter. The air crackled with electricity, the smell of ozone filling my lungs. When it finally faded, I was alone. The field was silent again, the circle of scorched earth still smoldering at my feet. I made my way back to the house, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight. Clara was waiting on the porch, her face pale as a ghost. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to tell her. "He's gone." She looked past me, her eyes scanning the horizon. "It'll come back," she said, almost to herself. "It always does." We never found Roy Weaver. The official report said he got lost in the cornfield, maybe fell and hit his head, but I know what I saw. And every now and then, on quiet summer nights, I hear that hum again, faint and distant, like it's calling me back. Being a sheriff in a Texas county means you deal with some real strange folks. People call you for anything, from missing cows to ghosts in their attics. Most of it's just noise, folks looking for someone to listen. But every once in a while, you get a call that sticks to you like a burr on your jeans. This one came from the Mathis family, out near Coyote Creek. Their ranch was about 30 miles from town, smack in the middle of nowhere. It was Ruby Mathis who called, her voice tight with panic. She said something was wrong with their water tank. Now, I don't usually get involved with water tanks. That's more a job for the county utilities, but the way she sounded, like she was scared to death, I figured I'd better check it out. When I pulled up to the Mathis place, Ruby was standing out by the tank, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She was a tough woman, Ruby. Raised 5 kids out here, buried 2 husbands, and still ran the ranch like a general. Seeing her scared didn't sit right. "What seems to be the trouble, Ruby?" I asked, stepping out of my cruiser. She pointed to the tank, a big rusted cylinder that stood about 10 feet tall. "There's something in there. I don't know what it is, but it ain't right." I frowned. "An animal, maybe a raccoon or a snake?" She shook her head, her face pale. "It's bigger, and it's moving." I climbed up the ladder on the side of the tank, flashlight in hand. The sun was just setting, casting long shadows over the ranch. When I reached the top, I pulled off the lid and peered inside. At first, I didn't see anything. Just water, dark and still. But then the beam of my flashlight caught something. Something pale and fleshy floating just below the surface. "What the hell?" I muttered. It looked like a hand. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. That's when it moved. The thing shot up from the water faster than I could react. I only caught a glimpse of it, long, sinewy limbs, a face that was all wrong, like someone had tried to carve a human head out of wax and left it in the sun too long. Its eyes were black, bottomless, and when it opened its mouth, I heard this awful, wet, gurgling sound. I damn near fell off the ladder, scrambling to get away. "Ruby!" I shouted. "Get back!" She didn't need telling twice. She ran for the house while I jumped down, my heart pounding like a drum. Once I caught my breath, I grabbed the shotgun from my cruiser. I wasn't sure if it would do any good, but I wasn't going back to that tank unarmed. Ruby met me on the porch, her hands shaking. "What was it?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not staying in your water tank." We circled around the tank, keeping a good distance. Whatever it was, it didn't make a sound. The water was still again, like it hadn't even been disturbed. "Maybe we just drain it," Ruby suggested, her voice trembling. I nodded. "Yeah, probably the safest bet." The tank had a valve at the bottom for drainage, but when I turned it, nothing came out. It was jammed, clogged with something thick and slimy. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, pulling at the gunk with my gloved hand. That's when the ground started shaking. It wasn't like an earthquake, not exactly. It was more like something big was moving under the ground. Ruby grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Sheriff, we need to go." I was about to agree when the tank started to creak. The metal groaned, the whole structure shuddering like it was under pressure. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the side of the tank burst open. Water poured out in a torrent. and with it came the thing. It was bigger than I'd thought, at least 10 feet long, its body a tangled mass of limbs and sinew. Its skin was pale and translucent, veins pulsing beneath the surface. And those eyes, black and empty, like staring into the void. It slithered toward us, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. Ruby screamed, and I raised my shotgun, firing off both barrels. The blast hit it square in the chest, but it didn't slow down. I grabbed Ruby and pulled her toward the house, slamming the door behind us. "Get your kids and get in the truck," I ordered, reloading the shotgun. Ruby nodded, running to gather her family. I stood by the window, watching as the thing circled the yard. It didn't seem to have a face, not really, but I could feel it watching me. The ground shook again, and I realized it wasn't alone. More shapes were moving out in the darkness, slithering toward the house. By the time Ruby got the truck started, the yard was crawling with them. I fired a few more shots, trying to keep them back, but it was like shooting at smoke. "Sheriff, come on!" Ruby shouted, the truck's engine roaring to life. I jumped in the passenger seat, and we tore out of there, leaving the creatures behind. We called in a hazmat team to deal with the tank, but when they showed up the next morning, the creatures were gone. All that was left was the busted tank and a yard full of dead grass. The Mathis family moved out a week later, and I can't say I blame them. I don't know what those things were or where they came from, but I know this: there's something out there in the dark, something we're not meant to understand. And if you ever hear strange noises coming from your water tank, my advice: don't look. You don't stay sheriff in a Texas town without learning how to handle strange calls. People see shadows, hear noises, or imagine things out in the middle of nowhere. It's part of the job. 9 out of 10 times it's nothing, but sometimes it's something. The call came in around 2 a.m. from a man named Emery Pike. He lived way out on County Road 92, near the old railway tracks. His voice was shaky, a raspy whisper like he was trying not to wake someone up. "Sheriff," he said, "there's a man in my barn." Now, a man in a barn isn't the kind of call you usually send deputies racing to. Ranchers deal with drifters sometimes, folks looking for a place to sleep or snagging a chicken for dinner. Still, Emery sounded spooked, and when a man his age sounds scared, you listen. I headed out there alone, the road stretching dark and empty under a moonless sky. The Pike place was tucked back off the main road, surrounded by mesquite trees and wide-open nothingness. Emery was waiting for me on the porch, his face pale as chalk. "You bring backup?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," I said, stepping out of the cruiser. "Figured I wouldn't need it. What's going on, Emery?" He glanced toward the barn, a sagging structure that looked like it hadn't seen repairs since the Carter administration. "He's been in there all night. I hear him moving around, but when I look, he's gone." "You sure it's not an animal? Could be a coyote or a raccoon." Emery shook his head. "No, sir, it's a man. I saw him. Tall, thin, too thin. And his eyes, Sheriff, they weren't right." I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the barn, my hand resting on the butt of my pistol. The wind was still, the kind of still that makes your skin crawl. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, it smelled like hay, rust, and something else, something faintly metallic. "Sheriff's Department," I called out. "If someone's in here, show yourself." Silence. I moved deeper into the barn, my boots crunching on the dirt floor. The stalls were empty, just shadows and cobwebs. But then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the loft above me. I climbed the ladder slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the top, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. It was tall, its limbs too long, elbows jutting out at odd angles. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over bones that didn't look human. "Sir," I said, my voice firm, "you need to come down from there." The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, my hand on my gun. "I'm not going to tell you again." That's when it turned. Its face was a nightmare. Hollow eyes, too wide and too dark, like staring into deep water at night. Its mouth stretched into a grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellow, too many for any human mouth. It didn't speak. It just tilted its head, studying me like I was the strange one. I drew my gun, my heart hammering. "Get down now or I'll shoot!" The thing let out a sound, a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. Then, faster than I thought possible, it scrambled across the rafters and disappeared into the shadows. I climbed down, my pulse racing, and met Emery outside. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not human." We stood there in the dark, listening to the silence, and then we heard it, a loud crash from inside the barn. I raised my gun and stepped back inside, but the thing was gone. The only sign it had been there was a pile of hay that had been shredded like paper and deep gouges in the wooden beams. I told Emery to lock his doors and call me if he saw or heard anything else. But as I drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake leaving him alone. The next morning, I got another call. This time, it wasn't Emery. It was his neighbor, Earl. "Sheriff," Earl said, his voice shaking, "you better get out here. Something's happened to Emery." When I got to the Pike place, it was a mess. The front door was wide open, the porch steps broken like something heavy had smashed through. Inside, the furniture was overturned, the walls scratched and gouged, and Emery was gone. The only thing we found was a trail of blood leading from the house to the barn. In the barn, the loft was empty, but on the floor, written in the dirt, were 3 words. "It's watching you." To this day, I don't know what that thing was or where it came from. We never found Emery, and his ranch has been abandoned ever since. But sometimes when I drive past that old barn, I swear I see something moving in the shadows, something tall and thin with hollow eyes. If you ever get a call about a man in a barn, my advice: don't go alone. Let me tell you about the weirdest call I ever got as a sheriff here in Texas. This one happened back in '97, on a cold October night. The kind where the air feels sharp and the stars don't seem to shine as bright. It started with a call from a trucker, a guy named Ray Lopez. He was hauling a load of lumber up Highway 84, heading toward Abilene. Around midnight, he called the station, his voice shaky. "There's a woman standing on Miller Bridge," he said. "She's just standing there in the middle of the damn road." "Did she look hurt?" I asked, already grabbing my jacket. "I don't know, Sheriff," Ray said. "She looked wrong." Miller Bridge wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find anyone at night. It spanned a narrow, muddy river surrounded by miles of scrubland, no houses, no businesses, just a cracked stretch of concrete that had seen better days. When I got there, the place was dead quiet. My cruiser's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the bridge ahead. Sure enough, there she was. Ela estava parada no centro da ponte, usando vestido claro que esvoaçava ao vento. Seu cabelo estava solto e emaranhado, quase cobrindo seu rosto. Ela não estava se movendo, apenas olhando para fora por cima da borda, como se ela estivesse esperando por som. Estacionei o cruzador a uma boa distância e peguei minha lanterna. "Senhora", gritei, pisando na ponte. "Você está bem? Preciso de alguns." Ela não respondeu. Nem sequer vacilou. Quando me aproximei, o feixe her skin was pale, too pale, like she'd been dipped in milk. Her eyes were wide, almost bulging, and her lips were drawn back in a twisted grin. It wasn't a smile, though. It was the kind of grin you see in nightmares, stretched too far, like her face wasn't made for it. "Ma'am," I said again, my voice steady despite the chill running down my spine. "This isn't a safe place to be. Let me take you somewhere warm." She turned her head slowly, her neck making a faint cracking sound, and looked right at me. "They took my baby," she whispered. Her voice was soft, barely audible over the wind. "What's that?" I asked, stepping closer. "They took my baby," she repeated, louder this time, her voice echoing off the empty bridge. I stopped in my tracks. Something wasn't right here. I've dealt with my fair share of distressed folks, but this was different. "Who took your baby?" I asked. trying to keep her talking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking toward the edge of the bridge. "Ma'am, wait!" I called out, rushing after her. But by the time I reached the spot where she'd been standing, she was gone. I looked over the edge, shining my flashlight down into the muddy water below. Nothing. No splash, no ripples. Just dark, empty water. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something on the ground where she'd been standing. A small, muddy footprint, like it belonged to a child. The next morning, I went back to the station and pulled up the old records. Miller Bridge had a history, all right. Back in the 1930s, a woman named Clara Hayes had drowned her infant son in the river before jumping off the bridge herself. Folks said she'd gone mad after her husband ran off with another woman. Since then, there'd been rumors. Truckers swore they'd seen her ghost wandering the bridge at night, always looking for her lost baby. I never believed in ghosts, not really, but after that night, I wasn't so sure. A week later, I got another call about the bridge. This time, it was a couple of teenagers who'd been out joyriding. She just appeared out of nowhere, one of them said, his face pale as a sheet. "We almost hit her, Sheriff, and then she just disappeared." I went back to the bridge that night, determined to put an end to whatever was going on. I brought a deputy with me, and we scoured the place from end to end. We didn't find anything unusual, no footprints, no signs of anyone living or dead. But as we were leaving, I swear I heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind. To this day, I avoid Miller Bridge whenever I can. People still report seeing her, the woman in the pale dress, standing in the middle of the road, looking for something, or someone. If you're ever driving that way late at night and see her, do yourself a favor. Don't stop. You spend enough time in law enforcement in Texas, you get used to weird calls. Drunk cowboys fighting over a poker game, lost hikers swearing they saw UFOs, or teenagers sneaking out to scare each other with ghost stories. But every now and then, you get a call that sticks with you. A call you can't explain no matter how hard you try. This story's about one of those calls. It started on a quiet Thursday night, not much going on. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the dispatcher buzzed me. "Sheriff," she said, "you might want to take this one. Got a guy claiming he's stuck inside a house that wasn't there yesterday." "Come again?" I asked, thinking I'd misheard. "He's out at Crossroads Creek," she said. "Says he's trapped in a house that just appeared out of nowhere." Crossroads Creek was one of those places locals whispered about, but never really explained. It was way out past the old cattle trails, surrounded by nothing but scrub and dirt. Folks said it was cursed land, but no one could agree on why. Some blamed Comanche burial grounds, others talked about settlers disappearing back in the 1800s. Me? I thought it was just a place where folks let their imaginations run wild. Still, a call's a call. I grabbed my hat, my flashlight, and my sidearm and headed out. When I got to Crossroads Creek, the moon was high, casting a cold light over the empty landscape. I parked my cruiser and started walking. About half a mile in, I saw it, a house sitting right in the middle of the clearing. The thing is, there wasn't supposed to be a house there. It looked old, real old. 2 stories, peeling paint, shutters hanging crooked. The kind of house that made you think of creaking floors and bad dreams. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard the voice. "Sheriff, over here." The voice was coming from a man standing in an upstairs window. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "Hold tight," I called up. "I'm coming in." The front door was half open, creaking on its hinges. The second I stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath. The floorboards groaned under my boots as I moved through the entryway. The place smelled like damp wood and something else. Something sour. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I made my way to the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the dark. As I climbed, I noticed the walls were covered in old wallpaper, the kind with faded roses that looked like they'd been crying for a century. When I reached the top, the man from the window was standing at the end of the hallway, his hands clenched into fists. "Thank God," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought no one would come." "What's your name?" I asked. "Tom," he said. "Tom Keller. I was driving home, took a wrong turn, and saw this house. I thought maybe someone could help me, but when I came inside..." He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the door at the end of the hall. "When you came inside, what?" I pressed. "That door," he whispered. "It doesn't lead anywhere, but something's behind it." I walked past him, my flashlight aimed at the door. It looked ordinary enough, wooden with a brass knob that had seen better days. But as I got closer, I felt it. The air around the door was colder, and there was a faint sound coming from the other side. It wasn't footsteps or voices. It was more like scratching. "Tom," I said, keeping my eyes on the door, "did you open this?" He shook his head. "No way. I tried to leave, but every time I go downstairs, the front door's gone." I reached out and grabbed the knob. The second my hand touched it, the scratching stopped. I opened the door. The room beyond wasn't a room at all. It was black, pitch black, like staring into a void. My flashlight didn't even penetrate it. And then, something moved. At first, it was just a shape in the dark, shifting and coiling like smoke. But as it got closer, I realized it wasn't smoke. It was something alive. 2 pinpricks of light appeared in the blackness, like eyes, and a low growl filled the air. "Sheriff, close it!" Tom screamed. I slammed the door shut and stepped back, my heart pounding. "What the hell is that?" I demanded. "I don't know," Tom said, his voice breaking, "but it wants out." We didn't stick around to find out. I grabbed Tom by the arm and we headed downstairs. The front door was there this time, thank God, and we bolted outside. When we turned back to look at the house, it was gone. To this day, I don't know what we saw in that house, or why it disappeared. Tom moved out of town a week later, said he couldn't stand being so close to Crossroads Creek. I still get calls about that place from time to time. People swear they've seen the house, standing out there in the clearing. But I never go back, and if you're smart, you won't either. The call came in at 1:27 a.m., right when I was debating whether to pour another cup of coffee or head home for the night. Dispatch patched through a frantic voice, a farmer named Eli Garrison. "Sheriff," he stammered, his words tripping over each other. "You gotta come out here. There's something wrong in my field. It's crying." "Crying?" I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah," Eli said, his voice shaking, "like a baby. Or maybe something worse." Eli's farm was about 15 miles out from town, a sprawling stretch of land that always seemed quiet, even during the day. I pulled up his long dirt driveway, my cruiser's headlights cutting through the dark, and found him standing on the porch, clutching a shotgun like it was the only thing keeping him alive. "Saw it again," Eli said before I even got out of the car. His eyes were wild, darting toward the fields behind his house. "Out there, near the scarecrow." I followed his gaze. The fields were just rows of corn swaying slightly in the wind, nothing unusual. "What did you see?" I asked, grabbing my flashlight. "It was moving," Eli said. "It looked human, but it wasn't. And the crying..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I walked out into the field, the dirt crunching under my boots. Eli stayed back, muttering something about needing to watch the house. The scarecrow was easy to spot, a tall, ragged figure propped up on a wooden cross in the middle of the corn. It wore an old flannel shirt and a burlap sack for a face, with black buttons for eyes and a crude stitched grin. As I got closer, I realized Eli wasn't lying about the crying. It was faint at first, like it was coming from far away. But with each step, it grew louder, sharper, until it sounded like it was right in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, sweeping my flashlight around. The crying stopped. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from the direction of the scarecrow. I spun around, shining the flashlight on it. The scarecrow hadn't moved, but there was something different about it. The grin on its face looked wider, more menacing. And then its head twitched. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, stepping back. The scarecrow moved again, its arms jerking slightly like a puppet on strings. And that's when I saw them. The hands. Human hands, pale and bony, sticking out from the sleeves of the flannel shirt. They weren't straw-stuffed gloves like I'd assumed. They were real. "Eli!" I shouted, backing away. "Get out here!" But before I could take another step, the scarecrow's head snapped up, and its button eyes locked onto mine. It jumped down from the cross like it was alive, landing in a crouch. The crying started up again, but this time it was louder, angrier, like whatever was making it wanted me to hurt. I pulled my gun, aiming it square at the thing's chest. "Don't move!" I barked, though my voice wavered. The scarecrow, or whatever it was, stood up slowly, towering over me. It tilted its head, that stitched grin stretching impossibly wide, and then it lunged. I fired twice, the shots echoing across the fields. The thing staggered back, letting out a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. But it didn't go down. It kept coming, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. I fired again, aiming for its head this time. The bullet tore through the burlap, revealing what was underneath. It wasn't human. The face beneath the sack was pale and featureless, with empty black holes where the eyes should have been. Its mouth was just a gaping void, screaming louder than anything I'd ever heard. I don't remember running back to the house, but somehow I made it. Eli was standing on the porch, his shotgun aimed at the field. "Did you see it?" I gasped, slamming the door behind me. "I saw it," he said, his face pale. "It's been here before, Sheriff, every harvest season for the past 5 years. Why the hell didn't you call me sooner?" "Because it never hurt anyone," Eli said, his voice trembling. "It just cried. But tonight it was different. It came closer." We stayed up the rest of the night watching the fields. The crying didn't stop, but the thing never came back to the house. By morning, the scarecrow was back on its cross, its head hanging limp like nothing had happened. I told Eli to burn it, to tear it down and get rid of every piece. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe it would help. And honestly, neither did I. A week later, I got another call from a farmer a few miles down the road. Same story, crying in the fields, something moving in the dark. "I don't go out to Crossroads Creek anymore. If the fields want to cry, they can cry without me. And if you ever hear crying in the middle of nowhere, do yourself a favor. Don't go looking for it.